So for this first exercise, we're going to be drawing a phone in Illustrator using some basic shapes that we've learned. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a document, and this assignment has to be submitted in tabloid format, which is 11 by 17. So I'm going to go ahead and choose print, and then go down to inches, and for the width I'm going to enter 17, and for the height I'm going to enter 11. And since the width is more than the height, it'll automatically put it into landscape format. I just need one artboard. Bleeds are fine at 0, and I'll just leave these at CMYK and high. They don't really matter for this assignment. So now that I have my document open, I want to go ahead and find the image of a phone that I found on the internet and place it into this document. So I'm going to go ahead and go up to File and down to Place. And this is going to allow me to find that image in my file system and put it into the document. So here's the one that I found. It's an iPhone 7. And when I click place, it's actually going to load it into my cursor. It's going to take a second to load. And there you can see that it's kind of attached to my mouse cursor. And what I can do now is kind of click and drag. This is going to allow me to size it to the size that I want. So in the document requirements, you have to put the original phone on the left side of the document and then the new phone on the right side of the document. So I'm going to kind of move this over so that it's on the left side, and then I'm going to select it and then hold down Option and click and drag using the selection tool to create a copy. And the reason I'm going to do this is because I want a reference point for the vector that I'm going to create. So eventually we'll delete this since we're going to recreate this image using vector tools, but for now it's going to be good to have a reference point. And in order to organize this document a little better, we're going to create some layers. So we haven't used layers before, but in order to use them, you want to go to the layers panel, which is available by default, but if you don't have it for some reason, you can always add layers or any other panel through this window. So layers are right here. You could just click that and add it to your panel system. So right now you can see there's one layer. It's called layer 1. And what we want to do is create a second layer so that we can use that for our vector images. So what we're going to do is go down to the bottom here, and this little icon with a folded up corner is the create new layer. So we're going to click that, and then we can double click on layer 2 to rename this. So we can call this vector, and then we'll double click on layer 1 and call this raster. So now we know that this raster layer is where all of our photographs are, and the vector layer is where all of our vectors are. The other thing we can do that's really useful is go ahead and click in this empty area to lock our raster layer, because since we're just really tracing over that layer, it's going to be much better for that to be locked. So now you can see we can't even select those items because those items are locked. If we want to select them or delete them, we have to first unlock them and then we can select them. But let's leave them locked for now. The last thing we want to do is select the vector layer, because that's the layer we want to add our vector shapes to. So let's zoom in a little bit on our phone and just take a look at how it's constructed. You can see that it's mostly constructed of simple shapes. The outer shape is a rounded rectangle. This button is a circle. The screen itself is a rectangle. And these buttons are kind of like rounded rectangles. There's also a rounded rectangle for this little speaker. I'll zoom in on that so you can see what I'm doing. I'm zooming in by holding down Option and then using the scroll wheel on my mouse. And then the little microphone up here is a circle, and this camera is also a circle. So we should be able to draw all this using basic shapes. If you run into a phone that is for some reason really crazy and doesn't have basic shapes, it might get a little more difficult, but do your best. Or if you want to keep it easier, just find a more simple phone. The other thing to note is that we don't have to draw anything that's actually on the screen. That's a little bit outside the scope of this assignment, so don't worry about what's actually inside the phone. And also, a lot of the colors on these phones are kind of like gradients. They're really shiny, and we could actually recreate that using gradient tools, but since we haven't discussed that yet, for now we'll just use flat colors. So this will be kind of a flat illustration of the phone, which is totally fine. So let's start by drawing a shape for the actual body of our phone. So I'm going to go and grab the rectangle tool, and then I'm going to kind of hover over in the corner and draw it so it's the right shape according to the size of the phone. So one problem that we have immediately is that the shape we created is sort of covering up the phone. And now we can't see what we're doing, which is causing us some problems. So one thing we can do is use this opacity slider. It's a great thing to do when you're just trying to see through objects, because at 100% opacity, the object is not see-through at all. It totally blocks all the objects behind it. But if you go down to like 50% opacity, then it's transparent and you can see through the object. So it allows us to see the object we're working on, but also the phone underneath, which is really useful. So let's grab the selection tool and just sort of resize this. I'm going to zoom in on that corner and just get it pretty close there. And then with the selection tool, we can also grab the anchor point to convert this into a rounded rectangle. So we can just drag that in until we have approximately the right rounded rectangle shape. There we go. That looks pretty good. I'm just going to kind of hold down space to use the hand tool to move around to check that it's all lined up, and it looks pretty close. So now we have to find the right colors for this shape. And I think the best way to do this is to make this the fill color white, which it actually already is. So that's assigned to the white swatch. And then the outer stroke, we can kind of use this gold color. And so what we'll do to select this gold color is actually use the eyedropper tool. This is a tool that we haven't shown you yet, but it's really useful for just picking out colors, especially when you're trying to reference a photograph. So what we'll do is we'll deselect the shape that we're on by clicking outside so that nothing is selected. And then we'll use the hand tool to kind of move over to this other phone so that we can select some colors from it. I'm going to zoom in kind of on this bezel, and we're going to pick the eyedropper tool, which looks like a little eyedropper, and just select kind of the middle tone here. We don't want to get the one that's super light. We don't want to get the one that's completely in the shadow. If we were replicating this phone in a photorealistic way, we'd actually create a gradient, since that's the way the colors are working on the phone itself. But I'll select something kind of in the middle. There we go. So it's kind of this tan color. And then in the swatches, what I can do is click this arrow and then go down and click new swatch. So this will create a new swatch based on that color. So whenever we need this sort of gold iPhone color, we can reference it with this swatch. So I'm going to click OK. And there it is. So it's that little swatch, and you can tell that it's a swatch we created because it has that little triangle in the bottom. So it's just going to place it right next to all those weird gradients. So now I'm going to zoom back out, and then what I can do is go ahead and grab the selection tool again, select the shape we're working on, and for the stroke color, I'm going to select that new swatch we created. And then I'm going to up the stroke width so that it's a little bit closer to the phone itself. So probably something around there is going to work good. Yeah, and that looks pretty good. So now let's work on this little circle button here. So what we can do is grab the circle tool or the ellipse tool and just drag and hold down Shift to constrain it to a circle, because we know this button is a perfect circle, so we definitely want to constrain it to make sure we're being precise. Then we can kind of resize it. It's another situation where I'll go down to 50% opacity. That way I can see through to what I'm doing. There we go. And I think this one's a little thinner, so I'm going to turn down the stroke just a bit. There we go. We can also create a shape for the screen itself. So this to me looks like just a regular rectangle. So I'm going to go ahead and select the rectangle tool. And I'm going to turn off the stroke for this. I'm going to turn that to none. And then for the fill color, I'm going to choose kind of a dark gray swatch. There we go. Then I'm going to click and drag. There we go. And then we also need to create these little items in here as well. So this is a rounded rectangle. It's just fully rounded, so the sides are actually complete circles. So again, we can create a rectangle tool. Make it about the right size there. And then just grab these anchor points and drag in. And if you drag in a certain amount, at some point, the rounded corners will turn red. And that means that you've reached the maximum rounding, which is actually what we want in this case. So that's probably about right. And then I'm just going to move this out of the way so I can reference the color. And it looks like my gray is a little too dark. So I'm going to move that back by hitting Command Z to undo the move that I made. Then I'm going to go to the swatches and select just a lighter gray. So I'm going to select more of a middle gray for that one. And then I'm going to use that same color to create a circle for this microphone. So I'm going to grab the ellipse tool and then just click and drag to create the shape. If you hold down shift, it'll constrain it to a circle, which is what we want. And that's actually a little bit big. So what I'm going to do is grab this corner anchor, and if I just hold down shift, it'll scale it down from the corner. But if I hold down shift and then also hold down option, it'll shrink it from the center point, which is really useful. So that's a little trick when you're working with any shapes and you want to reduce them the same on all sides. You can hold down option and shift will constrain the dimensions. Option will make it grow or shrink from the center. So that's useful in this case. And then we'll do the same for this little thing over here as well. Oops. And this inherited the old color I had. So one thing I can do is use the eyedropper tool and just eyedrop onto one of the other shapes. And this will make the selected shape, which is this circle, inherit all the color styles from this other shape. So it'll turn this shape the same shade of gray, and it'll also get rid of the stroke that I had on there, since this shape that I'm sampling from doesn't have a stroke. That's a little shortcut. I'm also going to make this just a little bit darker because it felt a little bit darker in the drawing. So I'm just going to go a few shades darker on that one. There we go. So we're getting pretty close here. Last thing we need to do is just put these buttons in. So the buttons to me look a little bit lighter than the bezel. So maybe what we'll do is just kind of sample a new color. So we'll take the eyedropper tool, and with nothing selected, because we don't want to change any of the shapes we've already created, we'll select kind of this lighter color there and then create a new swatch for that one. So that'll go right next to the other swatch. They look almost the same, but the new one's just a tiny bit lighter. And then what we can do is create a rectangle for these buttons. There we go. And then we can use the selection tool and grab those anchor points. So one thing that's happening here is those anchor points to convert this into a rounded rectangle aren't showing up. And the reason that's happening is because since this rectangle is so long and thin, there's not enough room for those anchor points. So sometimes if you're missing an anchor point like that, what you need to do is zoom way in until they appear. Because if you're zoomed way out, there's a certain level of zoom where Adobe Illustrator just won't include them because it would be too many different things to grab in a small space, and it just wouldn't be practical. So that's what we had to do, is just zoom in this case. And now we can pull those points in to create kind of rounded rectangles. There we go. And then we'll do the same on the other side using that same color. There we go. Pull those handles in to create rounded rectangles. And then we can actually copy these. So we're going to select this, and then while holding option, we're going to drag, and then we'll hold shift to constrain it to a straight up and down movement. So we can just make a copy. And shift will make it so that these are in exact alignment, which is good for in this case. We'll take this anchor tool and drag it down to resize it, since this button is bigger than that top button. And then we'll make another duplicate for this bottom button. There we go. So now what I want to do is make all of these shapes 100% opacity. So what we can do is click and drag using the selection tool to select everything, and then in this opacity box type in 100. Right now it doesn't say anything because some of the objects are at 50% and some of them are at 100, and so it just puts nothing there. But if we type in 100, it'll force all of them to be 100% opacity, which is what we want. So we'll type in 100 there and press enter, and then that'll turn everything 100% opacity. The last thing that we need to do is get rid of the image that's underneath this, because if you remember, we placed the image under there so that we could trace, but now we don't need that image, and it might be peeking out on the corners in some cases. You can see that shadow is kind of coming through when I zoom in. So we actually want to get rid of that to just clean up this image that last little bit. So let's go back to our layers panel, and we can actually lock our vector image for now and hide it. And then we can unlock our raster, and that'll allow us to select this image and delete it. And then we can go ahead and bring back our vector. So now we've gotten rid of that phone image that's underneath our vector image. So it's feeling really cleaned up. But there's one last thing I want to do, and it has to do with these buttons, which right now they're kind of sitting on top of the bezel, and that doesn't quite feel right to me. When I look at the original phone, the button is more coming from behind the bezel. So I want to recreate that look a little bit more closely. So what I'm going to do is first unlock the vector layer because I want to work on that layer. And then I'll lock the raster layer because I want to leave that alone. And then I'll select the vector layer since that's the one I want to work on. Then I'm going to zoom in on this button. And again, you can see it's just kind of sitting on top, which doesn't quite feel right. I want it to come behind that original bezel. So I'm going to select it. And when I click this little arrow on the vector layer, you'll see that it'll expand all the objects in that layer. So these objects, all these shapes that we've created, are ordered in a list. And the items that are on top of the list are going to come in front of the items that are on the bottom of the list. So this button that we have here is this item. You can tell that it's selected because it has this little red dot. So that's this object we have selected. And that's in front of this bottom layer, which is the phone bezel itself. So since this is higher up than this, it's going to sit on top of the bezel. But really what we want it to do is sit behind the bezel. So the way we can fix that is by clicking and dragging this to reorder it so it's on the bottom of the list. And now you can see that that button is coming behind that bezel and it feels a little more natural. It's actually not sticking out quite enough. So I'm going to select it and zoom in a little bit and just ever so slightly drag it out so that it's showing a little bit more. So that's one way to do that. Let me show you a second way to do that, which works just as well. So these buttons have the same issue. I'm going to select them with the selection tool by clicking on the first one and then holding down shift and clicking on the other two. So I have all three of these selected. And again, you can see that these are on the top of the list over here. And so that's making them come in front of the bezel, which is down here close to the bottom of the list. So I could click and drag these down here, but another way to do the same thing is to go up to Object and under Arrange, go to Send to Back. And so what this is going to do is send these to the very bottom of that list. So when I click on this, you can see that it rearranged this list to send those to the back. So they're now coming behind that bezel, just like the other button. The last thing I want to do is bring them a little bit out because they kind of have the same issue that the button on the other side was having, where they're not sticking out quite enough. So I'm going to select all three of these. And I'm just going to zoom in and just drag them a little bit more out. There we go. That looks better. All right, so the phone is ready to go. I mean, it of course doesn't look exactly like the other phone, but it's pretty close considering we're not using any gradients. And sometimes these flatter vector images are actually more aesthetically pleasing than the super shiny photographic ones. So there is a case for this type of effect. I think that the outer stroke is just a little too thick, so I'm going to select that and then dial down this stroke value from 4 points to 3 points. There we go. That looks a little bit better to my eye. So this document is ready to go. The last thing we need to do is save it in the right format. This assignment is supposed to be saved in PDF format. So in order to do that, I'm going to go up to the menu and File and go down to Save As. And then under Format, I'm going to scroll down to PDF. And then for the name, I'm going to use the proper naming convention for the assignment, which is your last name, which for me is Prairie, underscore your first name, underscore exercise, and then underscore 1, and then click Save. And then in this dialog box, you have a bunch of different settings that you can choose for how the file gets saved. The Illustrator default is actually fine for this assignment. You want to make sure you have Preserve Illustrator Editing Capabilities checked, because that's going to allow you to come back to this assignment if you need to make changes more easily. If you don't have that checked, it's going to be harder to come back in here and make changes because it's going to flatten a bunch of layers and just cause you some problems. So this will make sure that all of the organization you created is built into the document, which is a good thing. So I'm going to click on Save PDF. And there we go. This is saved and ready to be submitted into Blackboard.